But it was, presented to me, and I thought about it. Well, first, I actually thought.
On screen, Little House on the Prairie felt steady and warm, with Melissa Sue Anderson playing the quiet, thoughtful Mary Ingalls, while Michael Landon held everything together as Charles. It looked easy, almost effortless. But behind the scenes, that balance didn't always hold. As the cameras kept rolling, so did a tension Melissa Sue could no longer ignore, one that slowly turned admiration into something much harder to hide. So what really happened between Melissa Sue Anderson and Michael Landon when the cameras stopped? Stay with us as we get into the moments that changed everything. Why the creator of Little House walked away before the first episode. Little House on the Prairie didn't just appear out of nowhere as the quiet, comforting world people came to know. It started as something much more deliberate, built piece by piece from a set of stories that already carried a sense of history and lived experience. Loosely drawn from the books by Laura Ingalls Wilder, the series placed the Ingalls family at its center, settling them on a farm along Plum Creek near Walnut Grove, Minnesota, and following their lives through the late 1800s. At the heart of it all was a family that felt grounded and familiar. Charles, Caroline, and their daughters, Mary, Laura, and Carrie, were brought to life by Michael Landon, Karen Grassel, Melissa Gilbert, Melissa Sue Anderson, and twins Lindsay and Sydney Greenbush. On screen, they moved like a unit, each role fitting into the next in a way that made the world feel steady, almost untouched by anything outside of it. But getting there took its own kind of push behind the scenes. Back in 1972, television producer Ed Friendly, encouraged by his family, secured the rights to Wilder's novels from Roger Lee McBride. He brought in writer Blanche Hanalis to shape the story into a 2-hour pilot, something that could introduce audiences to this world in a single sitting. From there, he turned to Michael Landon.
Mike Landon and Ed Friendly as well. And Ed Friendly wanted to stay true to the books, but that would have been impossible, as you could tell.
Asking him to direct. Landon agreed, but only if he could also step into the role of Charles Ingalls. That decision set the tone for everything that followed. What began as a shared vision didn't stay that way for long. Differences between Friendly and Landon grew more obvious as the project moved forward, each holding on to a different idea of what the show should be. In the end, Friendly stepped away, leaving Landon with full creative control. From that point on, the direction of the series rested in his hands. The pilot aired on March 30th, 1974, drawing from Wilder's third book, Little House on the Prairie. It opened the door, but it was only the beginning. By September 11th, 1974, the full series arrived on NBC, and what started as a single story quickly stretched into something much bigger, running until March 21st, 1983. Even as the years passed and the cast changed, the world of Walnut Grove kept moving, adjusting just enough to keep going. By the 9th season, with Landon gone, the show carried on under a new title, Little House, A New Beginning, followed by 3 post-series films that tried to bring things to a close. At first, not everyone was convinced. Early reviews leaned in a different direction, often comparing the show to The Waltons, which was already finding its footing with audiences. But over time, something about Little House on the Prairie began to settle in.
And that was interesting, and it was fun because Al Triscone.
The audience stayed. Ratings held. And slowly, the conversation around it changed. What didn't land right away started to connect, and the show found its place, not just during its original run, but long after, continuing through syndication and onto streaming platforms where new viewers kept discovering it. And at its core, the focus never really drifted far from where it started. The Ingalls family remained the anchor, with many episodes following Laura as she grew, learned, and tried to make sense of the world around her. But the story didn't stay limited to just one perspective. It widened, bringing in neighbors, friends, and the larger Walnut Grove community, each adding another layer to what life looked like in that time and place. Charles worked the land and the mill, Caroline held the home together, and their daughters grew up in front of an audience that watched it all unfold, step by step. It all played out with a kind of ease on screen, the kind that made it feel simple. But behind that calm surface, there was always more going on, more decisions, more tension, more control shaping what viewers eventually saw. Blinded and broken, the grueling reality of playing Mary Ingalls. Before the Prairie, before Walnut Grove, before Mary Ingalls ever became a name people recognized, Melissa Sue Anderson was just a young girl growing up in Berkeley, California. Born on September 26, 1962, to James and Marian Anderson, she was the younger of two daughters, with her sister Maureen more than a decade older. Life didn't stay still for long. By the time she was 7, her family had moved from the Bay Area to Los Angeles, placing her closer to an industry she hadn't fully stepped into yet. When her parents divorced at 13, she was raised by her mother in a Roman Catholic home, holding on to a structure that would follow her through the years ahead. Her introduction to the camera came early and almost by accident. A dance teacher noticed something in her and encouraged her parents to find her an agent. From there, things picked up quickly. Commercials for brands like Mattel and Sears came first, small appearances that quietly built her confidence. Then television followed. She appeared in projects like The Brady Bunch and Shaft, taking on brief roles that didn't last long on screen but were enough to get her noticed. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a steady climb, one opportunity leading into the next. By the time she was 11, that steady climb turned into something much bigger. She auditioned for Little House on the Prairie and stood out among hundreds of other girls, landing the role of Mary Ingalls. It was the kind of moment that could define everything that came after, even if she didn't fully realize it at the time. The show itself was already building into something audiences would hold on to, rooted in the world created by Laura Ingalls Wilder and carried by a cast that felt instantly familiar. Mary wasn't meant to dominate the story in the way Laura did, but that didn't stay fixed for long. As Anderson settled into the role, her presence grew. She brought a quiet strength to Mary, something that made the character feel real in a way that went beyond the page. Early on, the writers held back, waiting to see what she could do. As she later explained, they needed to see it first before giving her more to work with. Once she proved herself in that first year, the material followed, and the episodes centered on her became heavier, more demanding, and harder to carry. And the show didn't hold back. What began as a gentle look at family life started leaning into deeper, more painful storylines. Much of that weight landed on Mary. One moment, she was the soft-spoken older sister, and the next, she was facing loss after loss, from going blind to enduring tragedies that kept piling up. It gave Anderson room to stretch as an actress, but it also came at a cost. There came a point where it stopped feeling balanced. She later opened up about how, after a while, it felt like her character was either standing in the background or trapped in one hardship after another, and that rhythm started to wear on her. Still, the role made her. Little House on the Prairie ran for over 200 episodes, becoming one of the most watched shows of its time, and Anderson grew up right in the middle of it. From 11 to 19, she moved through those years on screen, her performance earning her an Emmy nomination in 1978, the only one among the main cast. Off-screen, though, things weren't always as simple as they looked. The long hours, the demands of the role, and the environment around the production began to leave their mark, in ways that didn't always show during filming. Even then, there were moments where the balance felt different, depending on who held the control. And that quiet tension had a way of lingering. When her contract ended after 7 seasons, she stepped away, returning only briefly before the show closed out. It wasn't a dramatic exit, just a decision that felt necessary at the time. Years later, she would reflect on it with mixed emotions, holding on to both the opportunities it gave her and the weight that came with it. In 2010, she put those memories into words in her memoir, The Way I See It, a look back at my life on Little House, offering her own perspective on the years that defined her early career. Away from the Prairie, her path continued, though it didn't follow the same level of attention. She took on roles in films like Happy Birthday to Me, a sharp contrast from the image audiences were used to, along with projects like Chattanooga Choo Choo and Dead Men Don't Die. On television, she appeared in The Equalizer, a series created by her husband, Michael Sloan, where she found a sense of pride in her work that felt personal. Smaller roles followed, including appearances in Alfred Hitchcock Presents, before she gradually stepped back in the 1990s to focus on raising her children. She returned briefly in later years, with roles in 10.5, Apocalypse, the Veronica Mars film, and The Con Is On. But the pace had changed. The spotlight wasn't something she chased anymore. By 2022, she made it clear she wasn't planning a return to acting anytime soon, choosing instead to keep her distance from the industry that had once defined her. And yet, no matter how far she stepped away, the image of Mary Ingalls remained. That quiet presence, that steady voice in the middle of Walnut Grove, still lingers for those who watched it unfold. But when you look a little closer, beyond the softness of the story, it becomes clear that her time on the show carried more than what made it to screen, with certain dynamics behind the scenes leaving an impression that didn't fully fade once the cameras stopped rolling. The Dictator of Walnut Grove, Michael Landon's Unbending Rules. For a show that felt so calm and grounded on screen, the set of Little House on the Prairie carried a very different kind of energy once the cameras stopped. What looked like a close-knit family living simple lives was, in reality, a space filled with strong personalities, clashing dynamics, and moments that didn't always sit comfortably with everyone involved. At the center of it all was Michael Landon, not just as Charles Ingalls, but as the one holding creative control behind the scenes. He ran the set with clear expectations. No matter how young the actors were, they were expected to show up on time, know their lines, and carry themselves with a level of discipline that didn't bend. Actress Alison Arngrim later wrote about this in her memoir, describing a work environment where no one was pampered. There were no shortcuts, no special treatment. Everyone was expected to earn their place and understand the value of the work they were doing. That approach kept the production tight, but it also came with its own pressure. Landon's presence was felt in every part of the show, from the performances to the direction the story took. Over time, that level of control created tension behind the scenes. Even Ed Friendly, who had helped bring the project to life, found himself pushed out as creative differences grew. By then, it was clear that the balance of power on set leaned heavily in one direction. And it wasn't just about leadership. The cast itself didn't always move as smoothly as the families they portrayed. Friendships formed, but so did distance. Melissa Gilbert and Alison Arngrim were known to be close, often leaning on each other during filming. But that same connection didn't extend to everyone. Gilbert's relationship with Melissa Sue Anderson was far more complicated. On screen, they played sisters, moving through scenes with warmth and familiarity. Off-screen, that connection never quite settled. In her memoir, Gilbert opened up about how that distance was there from the beginning, describing Anderson as someone who kept to herself, someone she couldn't quite reach. She spoke about feeling that gap between them, a contrast between her own openness and Anderson's more reserved nature. Others on set noticed it too, describing Anderson as distant during their time working together. And while those tensions stayed mostly contained, the atmosphere around the set grew heavier as other issues began to surface. Karen Grassel later spoke about moments that made people uncomfortable, including how personal matters sometimes spilled into the workplace. Landon, who played the steady and dependable father figure on screen, was at the center of one of the most talked-about situations off-screen. He had begun taking a supplement he openly credited for boosting his energy, and he spoke about it often, sometimes more than people expected. Not long after, the truth behind that confidence became public. He was involved in an affair with Cindy Clerico, a young stand-in on the show. News of the relationship spread quickly, and it didn't stay contained within the set. It reached headlines, and once it did, the effect on the cast was immediate. For many, it wasn't just about the relationship itself, but who it affected. Landon's wife at the time, Lynn, was known to several members of the cast. She had welcomed them into her home and built connections with them, and that made the situation harder to ignore. Grassel later reflected on how difficult it was to process, especially knowing there were children involved. The personal became public, and the tension that followed settled into the environment everyone had to keep working in. Reactions varied, but they were strong. Catherine McGregor already had a strained relationship with Landon due to disagreements over pay and treatment, and this only added to it. For Melissa Gilbert, it cut even deeper. She had seen him as a father figure, someone she trusted. After learning about the affair, that image changed. She kept her distance from him and chose not to attend his next wedding. A quiet but clear sign of how much things had changed. Even outside of the emotional fallout, the production carried a sense of friction that never quite disappeared. The expectations were high, the environment was demanding, and the relationships between cast members didn't always match the warmth they portrayed on screen. For someone like Anderson, who was already navigating heavy storylines and long hours from a young age, it added another layer to an experience that was far more complex than it appeared. And then, as the series moved toward its end, that contrast between image and reality played out one last time in a way no one could miss. Walnut Grove, the heart of the show, the place that had come to represent comfort and stability, didn't fade quietly. In the final chapter, the town was destroyed, blown apart by its own residents in defiance of losing it to a developer. It felt dramatic, almost unthinkable for a place that had stood for so much over the years. But behind the scenes, the reason was far more practical. The set itself was dismantled to ensure it wouldn't be reused, closing the chapter completely. And in a way, that ending said more than it seemed to at first. What looked peaceful on the surface had always carried more underneath, and by the time it all came to an end, there was no real way to separate the warmth people saw on screen from everything that had been building quietly behind it. Ma versus Pa. The brutal contract battle that split the Ingalls family. If things already felt tense in quiet ways, the situation between Karen Grassel and Michael Landon brought it closer to the surface. On screen, they stood as the steady center of the Ingalls family, moving through each episode as partners who held everything together. Off-screen, that sense of unity didn't always carry through. The strain began around something practical, but it quickly became personal. Grassel wanted her contract to reflect the importance of her role. She wasn't just part of the background, she was Caroline Ingalls, the emotional backbone of the family. But when she pushed for a raise, Landon didn't see it the same way. From her account, he believed her pay should stay closer to what the younger cast members were earning. At one point, he even told her that her character wasn't a favorite with viewers, suggesting that it didn't warrant more money. That conversation didn't just stay in a meeting. It settled into the way they worked together after that. Communication became limited. There were stretches where Landon barely spoke to her, and the distance showed up in other ways too. Her screen time began to shrink, scenes that once gave her space becoming fewer and farther between. Even after she eventually secured a raise, the feeling between them didn't return to what it had been. By the time season 8 came around, she stepped away, her final appearance closing a chapter that had grown more complicated than it first seemed. Still, even in the middle of that tension, Grassl could see the pressure Landon was carrying. He wasn't just acting, he was directing, producing, and making sure the entire show stayed on track week after week. She described him as someone constantly on edge, juggling responsibilities that never really paused. There were meetings to handle, scripts to prepare, scenes to oversee, and very little room to breathe in between. And yet, in the middle of all that, he tried to keep things light. She remembered how he would go out of his way to make the crew laugh, to keep the energy from dipping too low. It didn't erase the tension, but it added another layer to who he was. Someone pushing himself hard while trying to hold everything together at the same time. Years passed, and life moved on for both of them. Grassl stepped away from the show and focused more on her personal life, putting distance between herself and the environment she had left behind. Then, about 5 years later, something unexpected happened. The phone rang, and on the other end was Landon. It wasn't a formal call, not something handled through agents or managers. He reached out himself, wanting to reconnect, to hear how she was doing. Along with that, he asked if she would consider returning for a little house on the Prairie special. That gesture carried weight. After everything that had happened, he chose to speak to her directly, to extend the invitation in a way that felt personal. She agreed, not because everything had been perfect, but because enough time had passed for things to settle. The tension that once defined their working relationship didn't need to carry forward. In that moment, there was space to move past it. A few years later, around 1990, Grassl reached out again, writing to him and sharing updates about her life. He responded by asking her to call, wanting to talk, to look back on the years they had spent working together. Their conversation touched on familiar ground, the show, the memories, even his growing family. There was a sense of ease there that hadn't always been present before. Not long after that, everything changed. Landon was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, a reality that came quickly and didn't leave much time. Within a year of that conversation, he was gone, passing away on June 1st, 1991. For Grassl, what stayed with her wasn't just the tension they had once carried, but the fact that they had the chance to clear it before it was too late. That final stretch, those calls, those conversations, gave a different ending to a relationship that had once felt strained. Melissa Sue reveals why she hated Michael Landon while filming Little House on the Prairie. For many viewers, Melissa Sue Anderson will always be Mary Ingalls, the quiet, composed older sister whose story carried some of the most emotional weight on Little House on the Prairie. She was only a teenager when she stepped into that role in 1974, but it didn't take long for people to notice what she could do. There was a control to her performances, a kind of restraint that made the heavier moments land even harder. By 1978, that work earned her an Emmy nomination. the only one among the main cast, and it confirmed what the show had already started to reveal. Her character's journey became one of the most talked-about arcs in the series. Viewers watched Mary lose her eyesight over time, a storyline that unfolded slowly and stayed with the audience long after each episode ended. It gave Anderson some of her strongest material, but it also set a pattern. As the seasons went on, the weight of Mary's story leaned heavily toward hardship, and there was less room for anything outside of that. From the start, Mary was never meant to carry the show in the same way Laura did. The original books by Laura Ingalls Wilder didn't center her as much, and that carried over into the series. There were long stretches where Anderson had little to do, moments where her presence felt quieter compared to the growing focus on other characters. When the blindness storyline came in Season 4, it changed that, giving her more depth to work with, but it didn't last in the way she might have hoped. As she got older, that imbalance became harder to ignore. The stories began to move in a different direction, following Laura, Almanzo, and a new phase of life in Walnut Grove. Mary's journey had already reached its peak, and what followed felt repetitive. Anderson later reflected on how it became either standing in the background or moving through another difficult situation, with little in between. After a while, it stopped feeling like growth and more like being stuck in the same loop. She stayed through Season 7 and appeared briefly in Season 8, but by then, the decision had already been made. After spending most of her adolescence tied to one role, she wanted something more, something that allowed her to stretch beyond what the show could offer. Stepping away wasn't about one moment or one conflict. It was a gradual realization that she had reached the limit of what Mary Ingalls could give her. Still, the experience wasn't only about the work on screen. Behind the scenes, her relationship with Michael Landon carried its own quiet complexity. It stayed professional, but there was a distance that grew more noticeable over time. Landon expected a lot from everyone, especially the younger actors, and that pressure could be hard to sit with day after day. He wasn't easy to approach, and for someone like Anderson, who already kept to herself, that created a space that sometimes felt isolating. There was respect there, no question about it. She recognized his talent, the way he held the show together, and the effort it took to manage everything both in front of and behind the camera. But at the same time, the experience wasn't always comfortable. The man who played the steady, dependable father figure carried a different energy when the cameras weren't rolling, one that could feel demanding, distant, and at times difficult to read. Over time, that contrast stayed with her, shaping how she looked back on those years. And while she didn't always frame it in dramatic terms, there were moments where that tension came through in what she shared later. Not loud or explosive, but enough to suggest that working under him wasn't as easy as it might have looked from the outside. It wasn't about one single incident. It was the accumulation of expectations, distance, and an environment that didn't always feel as warm as the story being told. After leaving the show, she moved into other projects, taking on guest roles in series like Chips, The Love Boat, and Fantasy Island, along with television films that allowed her to step into different kinds of characters. Over time, though, she began to pull back, choosing to focus more on her personal life and family. The pace slowed, and the spotlight became less of a priority. Looking back, her departure feels less like an abrupt exit and more like a natural point of change. Mary Ingalls had already lived through her most defining moments, and Anderson herself was ready to move beyond that chapter. Years later, distance brought a different kind of clarity. In her reflections, including her memoir, The Way I See It, she acknowledged both sides of the experience, the opportunities she was given, and the challenges that came with them. Her view of Landon, too, settled into something more balanced. She saw the flaws alongside the talent, the pressure alongside the success. By the time he passed away in 1991, she had made peace with much of what had come before. She attended his funeral, closing a chapter that had once felt complicated. Who was your favorite character on Little House on the Prairie? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.